The rainstorm hit the city with a ferocity that turned the bustling streets into rivers of glistening water. Umbrellas collided, horns blared, and pedestrians scurried for shelter. Inside his sleek black car, Alexander Grayson barely noticed. His focus was razor-sharp, his thoughts locked on the critical business presentation awaiting him across the ocean. As the CEO of one of New York's largest financial corporations, Alexander had no room for distractions. Emotions? They were luxuries, carefully tucked away behind his pristine suit and unyielding demeanor. But as the car slowed to a stop at a red light, something pierced his bubble of control. On the sidewalk, a young woman cradled a baby in her arms, huddling beneath a tattered coat as rain soaked them to the bone. Her sign, written in uneven, desperate letters, read, "Please help. We need food and shelter." Alexander's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He tried to look away, but her image lingered, etched in his mind like a haunting ghost. Her trembling arms wrapped protectively around the baby. The rain drenched her frail figure, and yet there was a defiance in her posture, a determination to shield the child at all costs. A memory flashed in Alexander's mind. Cold nights and empty stomachs, a time when he was just another boy trying to survive the streets. His jaw clenched. He'd spent years burying that past, replacing it with iron-clad discipline and an empire built on pragmatism. Yet now, sitting in his climate-controlled car, he couldn't shake the pull of that memory. The light turned green. His car moved forward, but Alexander found himself hesitating. Without fully understanding why, he rolled down the window. "Get in," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't want to trouble you," she stammered. "Trouble me or not, your baby doesn't deserve to be out in this storm," he replied. The rain hammered on the roof of the car, the urgency of his words matching its intensity. "Now get in." For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. Then, with visible reluctance and a glance at her child, she stepped into the warmth of the car. Alexander Grayson was the kind of man people admired and feared in equal measure. His name was synonymous with power, wealth, and unrelenting precision. From the outside, his life seemed flawless. A sprawling mansion, luxury cars, and a business empire that set the pace for the financial world. But beneath the surface, Alexander was a fortress of solitude, fortified by cold logic and an unspoken fear of vulnerability. "Perfection is not a goal," he often told his subordinates. "It's the baseline." His days were meticulously planned, every second accounted for. From the moment he woke at 5 a.m. to his late-night strategy meetings, Alexander's life was a series of calculated moves. He thrived in the high-stakes world of corporate strategy, where numbers were his allies and emotions his enemies. But this unyielding dedication came at a cost. The rare glimpses of his humanity were fleeting, a charitable donation here, a polite nod there. Genuine connections were a liability, and Alexander had long since decided that he couldn't afford them. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Alexander had understood hunger, cold, and desperation. Orphaned at a young age, he'd fought his way out of poverty with sheer grit and intelligence. But instead of softening him, those hardships had forged a man who believed that survival meant eliminating weakness. As his car sped through the city streets that rainy evening, Alexander's mind was a steel trap, filled with spreadsheets and boardroom negotiations. Yet, when he saw Grace, the young mother in the rain, something inside him cracked. He told himself it was a passing impulse, a momentary lapse in judgment. "It's just one night," he muttered as he drove her toward his mansion. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about the rain or the baby. It was about the look in Grace's eyes, a haunting mirror of the life he had escaped but could never truly forget. When they arrived at his vast mansion, the contrast was almost cruel. Grace, with her soaked coat and trembling hands, seemed out of place against the backdrop of gleaming marble and sprawling gardens. She stared at the house in silence, her disbelief palpable. "You can stay here for the night," Alexander said curtly, handing her a silver key. "I'll be back tomorrow." Grace clutched the key as if it might dissolve in her hands. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't," Alexander replied, avoiding her gaze. "Just take care of the baby." As he walked away, Alexander couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. He had given her shelter, but what had she given him? A reminder of the man he once was, and perhaps still could be. The tension in the car was palpable as Alexander drove through the rain-soaked streets. Grace sat in the back seat, holding her baby tightly, her eyes darting nervously between the man who had rescued her and the unfamiliar surroundings. The warmth of the car's heater gradually thawed her trembling body, but the chill of uncertainty lingered in her heart. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, breaking the silence. "Grace," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "And this is Lucy." Alexander glanced at them in the rearview mirror. The baby was impossibly small, her delicate face framed by wet curls. Grace's arms, though thin and tired, held Lucy with fierce protectiveness. "Where were you headed?" he asked, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. "Nowhere," Grace admitted after a pause. "There's nowhere to go." Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't push further, though the weight of her words settled heavily in the car. The rest of the drive was silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain on the windshield. When they arrived at his mansion, Grace's breath caught in her throat. The towering glass structure, bathed in soft lights, looked like something out of a dream, or a world she no longer belonged to. She hesitated as Alexander opened the car door. "Go inside," he said, gesturing toward the house. "You'll be safe here." Grace's legs felt like lead as she carried Lucy up the marble steps. The warmth of the interior enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the cold and unforgiving streets she had just left behind. The spacious living room was filled with modern furniture, sleek and minimalistic, yet strangely devoid of life. "You can stay in the guest room," Alexander said, pointing down a hallway. "There's food in the kitchen, and I'll make sure someone brings supplies tomorrow." Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. For a moment, Alexander didn't respond. His gaze flickered to Lucy, who stirred softly in Grace's arms. "No one should be out there in this weather," he said finally, his voice distant. "Especially not a child." Grace nodded, clutching Lucy tighter. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt painfully inadequate. Alexander didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, his mind already pulling him back to the world of business and strategy. But as he left, he couldn't shake the image of Grace and Lucy standing in his living room, their vulnerability stirring something he couldn't quite name. As the mansion grew quiet, Grace wandered through the guest room, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. She laid Lucy down on the soft bed, tucking the child into the thick, clean sheets. Lucy's tiny face relaxed, a rare moment of peace in an otherwise tumultuous life. Grace stood by the window, her reflection merging with the rain-drenched glass. Memories flooded her mind, unbidden and relentless. She had once been full of dreams, a promising student with aspirations of becoming a doctor. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Grace had worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship to one of New York's top medical schools. Her mother's pride and her father's quiet encouragement had been her anchors, keeping her grounded as she pursued her ambitions. But fate had other plans. A late-night phone call had shattered her world. Her parents had been in a car accident, leaving Grace alone and adrift. The grief was all-consuming, and the financial burden of their loss forced her to take on multiple jobs just to stay afloat. It was during this fragile period that Christopher entered her life. Charming and attentive, he seemed to offer the support she so desperately needed. "You don't have to carry everything on your own," he would say, his smile disarming her defenses. Grace had believed him. She had let him into her life, trusting him with her fears and her future. But Christopher's charm masked a darker reality. Over time, he became controlling, his affection turning into manipulation. He drained her savings, isolating her under the guise of love. The night she discovered his betrayal was seared into her memory. Confronting him had been futile. "What did you expect?" he had sneered, his voice dripping with cruelty. "You're nothing without me." When Christopher walked out of her life, he left Grace penniless and pregnant. The once determined medical student was now a homeless mother-to-be, forced to navigate the harsh realities of survival. The streets of New York were unkind. Grace learned to sleep with one eye open, to ignore the pitying or judgmental gazes of strangers. Food was scarce, and shelter even scarcer. But through it all, she clung to one unshakable purpose: Lucy. Every decision she made was for her daughter. The cold nights, the relentless hunger, the danger, they were all worth enduring if it meant Lucy had a chance at life. "You're my miracle," Grace would whisper to her baby, even as her own body ached from exhaustion. Now, standing in Alexander's mansion, the weight of those struggles pressed heavily on her. The luxury around her felt alien, a stark contrast to the desperation she had known for so long. And yet, as she looked at Lucy sleeping peacefully, Grace allowed herself a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. She sank onto the bed beside her daughter, her hand brushing over Lucy's soft curls. For the first time in months, Grace felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. But deep down, she couldn't shake the fear that this fragile refuge might be taken away as quickly as it had been offered. The rain outside continued to fall, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. Grace closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer for strength. Whatever tomorrow held, she would face it. For Lucy. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Grace felt a sense of calm. The mansion's warmth was a stark contrast to the icy streets she had grown accustomed to. After tucking Lucy into the softest bed she had ever seen, Grace found herself exploring the unfamiliar luxury around her. Each corner of the house told a story of wealth and power, a life she could hardly fathom. The kitchen gleamed under soft lights, its marble counters immaculate, and its shelves stocked with food she hadn't seen in years. Hunger gnawed at her as she hesitated before opening the refrigerator. Inside, fresh fruits, vegetables, and even milk stared back at her like treasures. "Lucy needs this," she murmured to herself, steeling her resolve. Within minutes, the smell of eggs and toasted bread filled the air. Grace prepared a simple meal with trembling hands, her heart pounding at the thought of being caught. Yet, as she watched Lucy stir awake to the aroma, the tension melted away. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, lifting her daughter into her arms. Lucy's tiny hands reached out toward the plate, her eyes wide with delight. Grace couldn't help but smile as she fed her daughter small bites. For the first time in months, Lucy laughed, a sound so pure it brought tears to Grace's eyes. Later, Grace found the bathroom, an opulent space with heated floors and a bathtub large enough to fit both mother and child. As the warm water enveloped them, Lucy giggled and splashed, her innocence breaking through the walls of Grace's exhaustion. "This is just for tonight," Grace reminded herself, her voice soft but firm. "We'll leave as soon as we can." But the house seemed to envelop them in safety, offering a fleeting promise of hope that Grace couldn't ignore. The following day, Grace and Lucy were playing in the living room when the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the house. Grace turned to see a striking woman standing at the entrance, her eyes sharp and assessing. Victoria Sinclair. Her presence was like a storm brewing, cold, forceful, and unyielding. She wore confidence like armor, but her gaze carried something darker: disdain. "And who might you be?" Victoria's voice was syrupy sweet, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Grace stood, holding Lucy protectively. "I'm Grace," she said simply, her tone polite but wary. Victoria's eyes scanned Grace from head to toe, taking in her simple clothes and the baby in her arms. "I see," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Alexander's latest charity project." Grace stiffened but didn't respond. Her grip on Lucy tightened as Victoria's words cut deeper than she expected. Moments later, Alexander appeared. His usually calm expression wavered when he saw Victoria and Grace in the same room. "Victoria," he greeted, his tone measured. "I wasn't expecting you." Victoria didn't wait for pleasantries. "I see you've been busy," she said, gesturing toward Grace with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "I'd love to hear the story behind this." Alexander's jaw tightened. He glanced at Grace, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and unease. "Grace and her daughter needed shelter," he explained. "It's temporary." "Temporary?" Victoria's laugh was cold and calculated. "Alexander, do you even know who she is? People like her, they know how to play the system. How do you know she's not taking advantage of you?" Grace's heart sank. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because of how easily it could be believed. She saw the flicker of doubt cross Alexander's face, and it was like a knife twisting in her chest. "I've seen this kind of thing before," Victoria continued, her voice a perfect blend of concern and manipulation. "She's probably here for your money, or worse." "Enough, Victoria," Alexander said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He turned to Grace. "Can we talk?" The tension in the room was unbearable as Grace followed Alexander to the study. Her stomach churned, the weight of Victoria's words hanging heavily between them. "I need to understand more about your situation," Alexander began, his tone guarded. "Is there anything you haven't told me?" Grace's breath hitched. She felt cornered, like a criminal being interrogated. "I've told you everything that matters," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not here to take anything from you." Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. "It's not that I don't believe you," he said carefully, "but I have to be cautious. The word stung. Grace realized that no matter how much she wanted to prove her integrity, she couldn't fight against the shadow of doubt cast by Victoria's venomous words. "I think I understand," she said quietly, her voice heavy with pain. "Thank you for your help, Alexander. But Lucy and I will leave now." Alexander's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't stop her. He watched as Grace gathered her things, her movements quick and precise. Lucy clung to her mother, sensing the shift in the air. As they stepped out into the cold, Grace felt a mix of heartbreak and relief. She had hoped for a chance to rebuild, but it was clear that trust was a fragile thing. Inside the mansion, Alexander stood alone, the echo of their departure ringing in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own emptiness. And though he didn't yet understand why, the loss of Grace and Lucy felt far greater than he could bear. The mansion was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence Alexander was used to. This was a silence that pressed against him, making the sprawling house feel emptier than ever. He wandered aimlessly through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Every corner reminded him of Grace and Lucy, the soft laughter of the baby, the quiet resilience in Grace's eyes. He sat down in his study, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Victoria's words replayed in his mind, and for the first time, he questioned himself. Had he been too quick to believe her? Had he let his fear of vulnerability cloud his judgment? As the hours passed, Alexander couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing sense of regret. He replayed every moment he had spent with Grace, her gratitude, her dignity, her unwavering love for Lucy. None of it matched the picture Victoria had painted. "Damn it," he muttered, standing abruptly. He needed answers, not assumptions. The next morning, Alexander hired a private investigator. He needed to know the truth about Grace, and he needed it fast. Days turned into a blur of waiting, his usual efficiency faltering under the weight of guilt. Each passing moment without Grace and Lucy felt like a lost opportunity to make amends. When the investigator finally returned with the report, Alexander's hands trembled as he opened it. The story that unfolded left him speechless. Grace had been a promising medical student, her life derailed by tragedy and betrayal. She had fought to survive, enduring unimaginable hardships to protect her daughter. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't sought pity. She had only accepted what she needed to keep Lucy safe. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He had doubted her, let her leave, and now he wasn't sure if she would ever forgive him, but he couldn't let it end like this. He needed to see her again, to tell her how sorry he was. With the investigators' help, he found the shelter where Grace had gone. As he stood outside the modest building, Alexander hesitated. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she refused to forgive him? Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. The door creaked open, and there she was. Grace. Her expression shifted from surprise to cautious resolve as she saw him. Lucy peeked out from behind her, her curious eyes widening at the sight of Alexander. "Grace," he began, his voice low and steady. "I know I'm the last person you expected to see, but I couldn't let things end the way they did." Grace said nothing, her hand tightening protectively around Lucy's small shoulder. "I made a terrible mistake," Alexander continued, stepping forward slightly. "I let someone else's words cloud my judgment, and I doubted you. But I know the truth now. I know everything you've been through, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for the way I treated you." Grace's eyes glistened, but her expression remained guarded. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you care? You made it clear that I didn't belong." Alexander's chest tightened. "I was wrong," he said simply. "When you left, the house felt empty, cold. I didn't realize until then how much you and Lucy had changed it. Changed me." Lucy stepped closer, her small hand reaching for Alexander's. "Uncle Alex?" she said softly. "Are you coming with us now?" Her innocent question broke the tension. Alexander knelt, his gaze level with Lucy's. "If you'll let me, I'd like to," he said, his voice warm. Grace's walls began to crack as she watched Lucy smile and take Alexander's hand. The sincerity in his words, the vulnerability in his eyes, it was something she hadn't expected from a man like him. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. "You don't have to trust me right away," Alexander replied, "but let me prove to you that I'm not the man who doubted you. Let me show you that I can be the man who helps you rebuild." Grace looked down at Lucy, who was now tugging at Alexander's sleeve, giggling. She thought of all the nights she had prayed for a chance, a real chance, to give her daughter a better life. Maybe this was it. "All right," she said softly, "but on one condition. This has to be real. No doubts, no half measures." Alexander nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I promise, Grace. I'll give you and Lucy the life you deserve. No fears, no doubts." When they returned to the mansion together, it no longer felt like an imposing structure. It felt like a home. Lucy's laughter echoed through the halls, and Grace's presence brought a warmth that had been missing for far too long. In time, Alexander offered Grace a position in his company, allowing her to regain her independence while also building their bond. Lucy grew up with the love and stability Grace had always dreamed of, and Alexander found a purpose beyond wealth and power. One sunny afternoon, as they played in the garden, Lucy looked up at Alexander and called him Dad for the first time. The word hit him like a tidal wave of emotion, solidifying what he had known for some time. They were a family now. Together they built a life of trust, love, and hope. A life where the past no longer defined them and the future was theirs to create. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt truly complete. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the garden where Alexander, Grace, and Lucy sat together. Laughter filled the air as Lucy chased after a butterfly, her tiny feet padding across the lush grass. Grace watched her daughter, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his eyes following Lucy's carefree movements. "I never thought life could feel this full," he admitted, his voice soft but steady. Grace turned to him, her gaze warm yet reflective. "Sometimes the hardest paths lead us to the most beautiful places," she said, her words carrying the weight of everything they had endured. "I've learned more from you and Lucy than I ever did from all the years of building my empire," Alexander replied, his tone sincere. "You've taught me what it means to truly live." Lucy ran up to them, her small hands clutching a flower she had picked. "Mommy, Daddy, look!" she beamed, her innocent joy lighting up the moment. As Alexander accepted the flower, his heart swelled. He had found something far more valuable than wealth or power, a family built on trust and love. Grace smiled, placing her hand over Alexander's. "We've all found something," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "A second chance. Did you enjoy this heartwarming story? If this tale of redemption, love, and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. We wish you an incredible day filled with hope and joy. See you in the next video.